So rather than talking about the worst case scenario, let's talk maybe about the majority. What's happening to the majority of fishes?
Yeah, so the majority of fishes are actually captured not by hook and line. They're most often captured by some kind of seine net. And a seine net is effectively a huge net that's dragged behind a boat. And it can vary. It can vary in size. Sometimes it's dragged behind two boats that are separated from one another. So the nets can be massive. They can be drawn over vast distances for long periods of time. And it can be set at pretty much any depth. So on average, basically what's happening to a fish in that time. First, it tries to maintain its speed and keep in front of the net. Eventually, it tries to turn around and escape, or it's exhausted and falls back into the net. Obviously, that's not a happy start. Once it gets into the net, it can be crushed by the other fishes as it's being drawn along. Eventually, the nets are drawn to the surface. Now, depending on how deep they are, if it's a deep sea trawl, then on the way up, the fish suffer from barotrauma, which basically means anybody who's tried to dive down and your ears start to hurt when you're snorkeling, it's the opposite. As you're coming up, the gas inside your body expands, and it expands rapidly. And the higher you go, the faster that happens. And so it's a terrible experience, because any air bubble of any description inside your body basically explodes. And it can be air bubbles in your circulatory system, in your veins and your arteries. It could be in your heart. It could be in your swim bladder. Now, most of the time, or in your stomach, most of those animals have a swim bladder of some description, and the air cannot escape from that swim bladder fast enough, and so it ruptures without doubt. Sometimes the stomach and or the swim bladder are forced out through the mouth because there's nowhere else for it to go. And so, of course, that is a really horrible experience, as you can imagine. All right, so they get to the surface, and the horror story has really only just started, because then they're brought up into the air, and they're already being crushed underwater. Well, now they're experiencing gravity and the weight, not only of themselves, but all the other fish in the net. And then, of course, they're dumped onto the deck of a boat where they're sorted. Many of them are gaffed in the process, so they're literally hooked as part of the sorting process. And a good number of them will suffocate, if they're not already dead, on the surface on the deck of the boat. To make matters worse, as if it could get any worse, most of those fishes, after being through that trauma, are actually put on ice. And for most fishes, ice just slows down the metabolic rate. It doesn't kill them. So in fact, what you're doing is prolonging the suffering. And a fish might stay alive for 2-3 hours on ice before it eventually dies, and it dies from suffocation ultimately. So the entire experience is, from any stretch of the imagination, is a horror show from start to finish. And frankly, if people thought about it, you would never eat fish that were captured by a commercial trawler, ever. Not to mention the fact that most of those fishing industries are subsidised by government, because they're inviable economically without subsidy. It doesn't make any sense from a welfare perspective, and nor does it make economic sense. But that's why that industry is failing. We've fished the daylights out of the sea. There's nothing left. And there will come a time where that kind of commercial fishing won't exist anymore.
What you've just described sounds like a complete horror show. It really does. It's it makes you think that one day perhaps people will look back on this in the same way that we look back on people just burning cats alive or whipping bears just for pleasure. It just seems like so barbaric.
Yeah, and it is. There's no two ways about it.
And the scale of the number of individuals this is happening to is just incomprehensible. I suppose this is happening to more individuals each year than the total number of humans on Earth.
Yeah, by a long way.
Yeah, I mean,
we're talking. I mean, the numbers they're conservative. The numbers we're talking about between 1 and 3 trillion individuals. This is based on the number of reported landings by the FAO, right? The Food and Agricultural Organization. So this does not include bycatch, which is massive. It does not include any of the countries that don't report to the FAO, and it doesn't include any of the boats that are obviously operating black market. Which, I mean, don't underestimate how huge that is. It's massive. So, I would say conservatively, somewhere in the order of 5 to 10 trillion individual fish would be more like it if you do a back of the envelope kind of calculation. And that's 10,000 times worse than anything we do in terrestrial systems. And that's just the numbers, and the scale of the pain inflicted is just off the charts.
Yeah, sounds unbearable and doesn't really seem like something I can comprehend. We wouldn't. What you've said sounds awful, but when you're talking about something this bad, I don't think you can really do it justice, because like we were talking about before, you never know what it's like to experience what someone else is experiencing. We can tell each other and we can say out of 10 how painful is it, but we don't really know. And when it comes to that level of unbearable suffering, it's something that most of us luckily never have to experience. I mean, it's enough to keep
those fishes are getting 10 every time.
I mean, that's enough to keep you up at night, isn't it? That kind of suffering.